Hello, hello. Good evening. I see some familiar faces. Thanks so much for joining us on our second Tuesday, our Writing for Your Life Writer Discussion Group. We're really pleased this month to have with us Marilyn McEntyre. Marilyn's a writer and professor of medical humanities at the UC Berkeley UCSF Joint Medical Program. Marilyn's the author of 14 books, including the recent released A Faithful Farewell. She's won several Outstanding Teacher Awards, and she's been a featured speaker at many of our conferences. Some of my favorite books are Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies, Make a List, Word by Word. Marilyn's got a ton of just wonderful accomplishments, I guess is the best way to say it. So Marilyn, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
So our topic is disarming, right? So and what was the subtitle that?
The subtitle was dealing with loaded language.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So as always, folks, feel free to raise your hand through the Zoom portal. The reactions button under that has a little thing called raise your hand, or you can type questions into the chat box and I will repeat those verbally so people can hear them too. And so, Marilyn, do you want to go ahead and just kind of introduce the topic for us?
Sure. Yeah. It's really nice to see you all. And I like when it's small groups, and you please do interrupt. It'd be fun to have it be a conversation. I have done workshops at various places on the issue of loaded language. And I usually start with just asking people, what are some loaded words that you just feel you can't use in groups whose faith tradition or political persuasion or position on particular things you're not sure of. And it's pretty amazing. Everybody has a long list, and most of them are political. Some of them have to do with race or age or disability or gender. And so we are really navigating an environment of a lot of changing language. And I think that the rate at which language is evolving, and it always does, is of course speeded up because of the many, many layers of mass communication that are so instantly possible. So words keep morphing. And so any linguist will tell you that is a natural process, but it's not exactly, quote, natural that it moved this fast or in quite so complex a way. And that's combined with the fact that our fields of discourse, the language environments that any of us inhabit, are somewhat siloed. So I imagine most of you could come up with coded language that's very comfortable with particular groups that you identify with. But when you're outside of that group, you either have to explain yourself or you hesitate to use those terms. So that's what I mean by loaded language. And I can give examples, but Brian, I wonder if you have questions you want to pitch to me to give it a direction. Otherwise, I'll just go on.
You're the expert. I'd love to hear what some of the people's items are. What are the loaded words?
Yeah, if you want to give me some loaded words, I'll just take notes on you all and then we'll go from there. Words that either you are aware that when you use them, you have to think twice, or you know that you're going to get pushed back if you use that word, or anything that sort of requires care when you use it in public. So I don't just mean loaded as in derogatory. I mean loaded as in it's likely to be misunderstood. Oh, one here was rainbow. Brian, I'm going to let you monitor the chat just because it's hard.
Sure. Yeah, rainbow. The two I've thought of right off the bat were progressive and racist.
Yeah.
Sarah, go ahead.
I think social justice sometimes has extra meaning.
That's right. Yeah, in Christian circles, and by the way, Christian is a big one. Yeah. But social justice has come to be a sort of tag word where people associate that with a progressive agenda. Right. And obviously the word evangelical is very loaded these days. What are some other examples?
I was going to say liberal theology is many times misunderstood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you attach the word liberal to anything. And of course, it's differently loaded when you attach it to theology than when you attach it to a political agenda. Yeah.
Vicki, go ahead.
Woke.
Woke. Yeah.
What does that mean?
Thank you.
Can somebody
And thank you. And
describe
sure
that?
does trigger.
Karen, go ahead.
Well, I think anytime you mention anything around the earth, global warming or just those terms, caring for the earth can set people off.
Right. So the terms like environmentalist, which I think a lot of environmentalists don't use because that's become very loaded. And if you attach earth and a hyphen to things like earth care or earth keeping, that was one workaround that a lot of actually Christian environmentalists were trying to use, because creation care and earth care link that project more closely to biblical language. Biblical language is loaded too. And I know that in Jewish circles, there are, for the Seders that they do at Passover, there is a whole feminist Haggadah that has rewritten the whole Passover liturgy with a view to changing the gender language. And the NRSV version of the Bible rewrote texts to try to make them more gender neutral. And so the matter of translation, especially translation of sacred texts, is always very loaded. And that's a pretty good list that we've come up with so far. And so I'm just going to kind of break this down and then talk about some strategies with you for dealing with loaded language. And there are several, and they're certainly not foolproof, but again, interrupt anytime. But just to talk about the different areas in which loaded language just routinely is an issue when you move into public and write or speak. There's always all kinds of military languages riddled with euphemistic terms. And right now, when we talk about the war going on in Ukraine, we know that Putin won't even call it a war. And the Israelis won't call what's happening in the Palestinian territories an occupation. As soon as you use those terms, you've taken a position. And then the language that we use, the euphemistic language that we use to justify or somehow obscure what we're actually doing, like obviously collateral damage, so that we can avoid saying the people who got killed by our weapons when we're actually ostensibly aiming somewhere else. Lots of language to avoid the fact of civilian killings, to avoid the naming what particular weapons do, that kind of thing. So euphemisms in any area are heavily loaded. If you want to look at more generic political language, just think about the terms Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, progressive, fascist these days, which is more in use because there's more of it, more tendency toward what has historically been defined as fascism happening in this country. Illegal, as in illegal immigrants. Terrorist, how do we define a terrorist? Security is a loaded term. So some of these obviously are terms that have a heavy load to begin with. They are euphemistic. They're terms that people would put in quotes, or some people would. Others seem like pretty ordinary terms. A term like protect, to protect our national interests. That's just a lot to unpack. What are our national interests, and who's we anyway, and what exactly are we protecting, and how is it being, are we protecting and defending, or are we being aggressors? Just layers of questions to raise about what seems like a fairly straightforward phrase. I think about the words gun control. The word control has a whole agenda behind it. that is highly controversial. And even gun. What's a gun? Are we talking about the kinds of semi-automatic weapons that people are now carrying, or a handgun? And who is going to do the controlling? So you use these shorthand terms for something that we all kind of nod and think we know what we're talking about, but they're really easily misunderstood. And I'll come back to some of these, but just to give you more of an inventory, faith language. As I already said, Christian is a really tricky term. I have taught at a small Christian college, Westmont College, wonderful place in Southern California, which is Christian, they describe themselves as broadly evangelical. And they've really been working on, and all Christian colleges work on the language they put out there now because it's so loaded. So they came up with the term broadly evangelical because it's historically evangelical, but evangelical didn't mean the same thing in 1949 that it means now. And then I have also taught at University of California at Berkeley, which is really not a Christian college. And so when you say Christian there, you're more likely than not. Of course, there are plenty of Christians on campus, but you're very likely to get a certain kind of recoil, like, oh, you're one of those people. And you get associated with a particular band of people who use the term Christian, often in ways that I really wouldn't. So there's a lot of resorting to faith communities and spirituality and terms that broach the fact that you are a person of faith. And so some of this has to do with, at what point do you feel it's important to bring Jesus' name into it? Because Jesus is also a loaded term, and too many people have heard it sort of compromised and made into a comic term when people are imitating the worst of the sort of televangelists. So that I think is something to navigate. When do I profess my faith and in what way? Obviously, language about race and ethnicity and terms like woke, the term critical race theory, which is so widely abused, misunderstood, misapplied. That's a big one right now. Racism is something that has to continually be unpacked and re-explained depending on the audience. And then these various terms for groups of people. Do you say Mexican or Chicano or Latino? In what those terms overlap? Or do you refer to Native Americans or indigenous people, or do you refer to them by tribe? Do you at what point do you use the term African American as opposed to Black? When do you even use the term minority? And so that comes with the whole question of who gets to say what? Who gets to tell what stories? Who gets to use what terms? And right now, just be patient because I'm just still spelling out the problem. There's language about gender and disabilities, transgender designations, who wants to be called what? And the whole business about pronouns is really, I don't know, this is maybe more true of some regions than others. But most of the people I know in the Berkeley circles, I haven't done this because I just feel like I've aged out of this somehow, but a lot of people put their pronouns at the end of their email as a tagline, she, her, hers, or they, them. Those are the pronouns they want used. I still have a hard time with the logic of using a plural for a singular, but I'm fine with a neutral pronoun. So we have to find our own place in this conversation too. And I talked to a person who has been disabled for many years about terms like handicapped and disability. And one of the ones she really reacted to was wheelchair bound and also bedridden. She said, she hates that. She does have to sit in her wheelchair whenever she's not in bed, but she doesn't want to be identified with that chair. And the idea of being someone who is bound to any piece of machinery that's part of her identity is kind of offensive. And then I've talked at length with a woman who has done a lot of work with people with mental illnesses, and she finds that diagnostic terms are sufficiently problematic that she won't use them, the DSM terms. So she'll say, I have a son who has a chronic mental illness, and then she'll say something about it. I've known this woman for about 6 months now, and we've had a number of conversations about her work with mental illness. And I still don't know what the diagnosis is for her son. She doesn't use the diagnostic term. Other people find diagnostic terms are really comforting because they can give them a strategy for approaching the condition. And is it a condition, or is it an illness, or is it a syndrome? So, I mean, I've worked with medical students for years at Berkeley in medical humanities, and I have a whole handout on loaded language in medicine. That's its own talk, but some of those are, for instance, futility. That's a medical term when they decide that a certain treatment is futile. And futility is a category that has some protocols attached to it. But of course, futility is slippery. Consent is slippery. What are we calling consent? These are legal terms. Then there's language that goes with social status and class, like affluent or poor. Is poor a derogatory term? I've heard many people just avoid saying poor, and it makes a difference to people whether you say the poor or poor people, or people who are poor, or simply, people who are financially challenged. I mean, there are a variety of workarounds there. We talk about movers and shakers. We talk about well-heeled people and so on. So these all have their own coloration. I think about language in business. One of the ones that really bothers me sometimes is development, because development covers over so many layers of process that need to be interrogated individually. Like, what are you plowing up in order to put in a development? What materials are you using? Who are you displacing? At what cost? At whose cost? And so on and so on. So development sometimes comes at too great a cost for some people. When we talk about developing countries, does that mean that they are going to reach the level of consumption that we either enjoy or suffer from? That's what it is. When we talk about development, it does tend to take on the coloration of becoming like us North Americans. And in education, I have a whole rant about this. I won't go there, except to say that the word outcomes is a serious irritant to me, because there's so much language in educational circles about outcomes, which means measuring outcomes, which means if you can't measure it, it doesn't matter. And I have to say, if you're teaching King Lear, you really aren't going to get the outcome at the end of a semester from a sophomore in college. You may get an outcome 15 years hence when they see some of the issues that arise between parents and children who are entering adulthood. So outcomes implies a whole approach to education that often doesn't get sufficiently articulated. Or a term like excellence. Again, it begs the question of who determines what is excellent, how we measure that or don't, how we discern what is excellent. So that's probably enough spelling out the problem, because I don't want to spend the whole time on what a problem it is. But you see how in every area of life, we inhabit a discursive environment. We inhabit a language environment. And just like the water, that so many of us have the privilege of drinking from a tap without thinking about it too much. Once you are aware that the water is polluted, you look hard at it, you boil it, you ask questions about it, you write letters to the utility company. But it's the same way with language. We would like to think, I think, that that we know what we mean and our hearers or readers know what we mean. But what we mean is sufficiently murky at this point that it seems to me that if you write or speak in public, language has to be part of what you actually focus on. You have to talk about it, not just use it. And that's why in my writing workshops, I pretty much always recommend that at some point in anything you're writing, unless it's a poem, and maybe in a poem, you pause somewhere in the paragraph and comment on one of the words you're using, just to normalize the fact that while we're using the language, we're also talking about it. We're also paying attention to it. So if I use a word like Christian, I pause over it. I don't apologize for it, but I try to give it some time, and I try to acknowledge that these days that term can be heard in a number of ways. So here's what I mean. And then you develop the elevator speech or the little meta conversation around the word. That's one strategy. But let me stop there for a moment and just ask if there are comments thus far, and then I'll look at a few strategies for dealing with it.
Marilyn? Yeah.
Yes.
One of the things I notice is people do not define their words. And then they banter, even in a simple discussion, assuming that, well, any of these words that you mentioned, that they're talking about the same thing when they're not.
Right.
And that's something I have found to be true, for a long time. So it really pays when you're writing as well as speaking to define your terms.
Right.
At least, to put that out there and then go on with the conversation if you can, and explain, hey, maybe I'm just going to use the word disabilities. Maybe we're not talking about the same thing. How do you define it? This is how I define it, so that you actually have a real conversation.
Right.
So the definitions are very important.
Right. And thank you for
And
that.
I would love to take your class.
Well, thank you for that. And I think that the matter of definition is a very important one to address, which is one of the things I don't teach that many early undergraduates anymore, but one of the things I decided not to allow was you just don't get to say according to Webster. You can go look it up. But defining a term, as you rightly point out, has more to do with here's how I use it, dear reader. So here's when I use the term, progressive in a theological context, it has to do with how I read the Bible, what I understand by a sacred text. It has to do with what I foreground and background in my faith practices. It has to do with what I've decided to deeply rethink since my evangelical childhood. And so I think, what do I mean and what do you mean are questions to hang on to in any conversation, even if you don't say them out loud. And I think we should say them out loud. What exactly do you mean by that? And there are gentle, kindly ways to ask that instead of, wait, what do you mean? You can just say, could you explain a little bit what you mean when you use that term? One of the people I read daily is Heather Cox Richardson. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her, but she's a historian. She teaches history, and she's an American historian, and she really has done a deep dive into the history of the Republican Party, history of American politics. And she's great about connecting the word Republican with what was going on under the Lincoln administration and how Republican meant something profoundly different then, meant something different under Rutherford B. Hayes, and it meant something different under Hoover and Eisenhower and Reagan and Bush and both Bushes and Trump, so that she doesn't let us forget that the word has a history during which the political, the defining political issues have almost completely inverted themselves. So that's one way of defining, to say, I know that, for instance, the term evangelical has a long and complicated history. Here's what I understand by it. That takes, what, 2 sentences or maybe 3. And then you move on in. But to accustom ourselves and other people to just that little pause for language is, I think, a way of avoiding so much misunderstanding and conflict. So that's what I call the meta conversation, having the little conversation about the conversation. And that's one strategy.
Marilyn, Vicky's got her hand raised, so why don't we let her ask a question or make a comment?
I just wanted to say I've found in recent years it's helpful to take the prefixes that have a negative connotation off of words. For instance, if you're talking about bipolar personality disorder, I just say that person has a bipolar personality, and that takes some of the stigma away, the negative stigma, and normalizes the term and just acknowledges, well, they've got the borderline bipolar or borderline traits, and this is their personality, but taking the negative stigma out.
That's a wonderful workaround. And I think a lot of people who have dealt with terms that they don't want to describe themselves have really put some thought into exactly that kind of workaround. What is it that hurts? How could I help people? And I love the word you use, normalize. Help people normalize a different way of hearing this. And the question, what have we normalized? What do we just not hear anymore or see anymore because it's come so normal? Well, part of our work as people who deal with words is to help people hear what they're not hearing or see what they're not seeing, and also to take what they think they're seeing and crack it open and say, you know what, there's a whole lot going on backstage here. Yeah, looks like there's another question.
Yeah, Karen, go ahead, Karen.
Well, it's not so much a question as an observation. I noticed that some of the challenges when you're working across cultures, for instance, when I served overseas as a mission co-worker, and I would come back to the United States and talk to them about the church in the Czech Republic. The church there is called the Evangelical Church of Czech Brethren. And every time I did a presentation, I always had to explain what evangelical meant, because in the Czech context, it means Protestant. In the Czech, German, European context, evangelical means Protestant. In our context, it means something very different. And I had to do the same thing when I would talk to groups of people in the Czech Republic. And so when you're dealing with different languages, that makes a nice entree into the realization that words don't mean the same thing to everybody. Even translation is interpretation. And so that always made a nice segue, and it was a good reminder to me as a preacher every Sunday, because a lot of times I talk about the Hebrew and the Greek of the text.
Oh, bless.
And so that makes an easy entree to say, we think we know this word means da, 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 da. But actually, if you look at its origins or what the Greek is, it challenges us to really reinterpret or reimagine what that word might mean, that it may not mean what layers of meaning we've given to it. And it helps us go back, like you were saying with the thing about Republican, it helps us look back at the history that a word doesn't always mean the same thing.
Right.
That what it means for us today in America, in the United States, it may not mean that way. It may not mean the same thing in the Czech Republic or in Germany or another country. So I found that as a really good reminder for me to not make assumptions about what we mean when we use English either.
Yeah.
To offer that interpretation.
Thank you. And well, first of all, I want to personally thank you for bringing Hebrew and Greek into the pulpit. Mm-hmm. My husband is a retired Presbyterian pastor, and he got to study Hebrew and Greek, and I didn't. I'm really consumed with envy, but I did say, you got to do that. We didn't. We support seminaries. You take it into the pulpit and open this stuff up for us. And one of his best sermons was about the term schizomeno, which is in the scene of the baptism of Christ. Is in the heavens opened. And
Open, were ripped open, were
But
torn
his-
open. Yeah,
right, that the heavens were ripped open. And
yeah,
he called his sermon Ripped Open.
yeah.
That's so much difference in how you hear that text. This was really a breaking into history, not just a gentle, just
Mhm.
above. So we need that.
Yeah.
From anybody.
And I'm Presbyterian and I'm serving in a Disciples of Christ congregation. And the same thing, that the disciples pastors don't take Hebrew and Greek. Now at the time, I wasn't thinking of that as so much as a privilege. I'm also legally blind, so getting to take Hebrew and Greek was quite a challenge that most people thought I wasn't going to be able to manage, and I did fine. So I also have a whole layer of issues around the language we use around blindness and disability, and I'm constantly reinterpreting, how we talk about that and the visual words that we use and this kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, to me as a pastor, it's really critical to be able to go back. My Hebrew is not nearly as good as my Greek, but to be able to go back and look, what was the text saying? And as you say, it really opens it up to make us think about because every translated word is an interpretation of that translator. And so, yeah.
Get to the matter of literalism. My husband asked Ian Torrance, who was then president of
My seminary.
seminary. Oh, you went to Princeton. Okay.
Mhm.
So when Torrance first came from Scotland,
Mm-hmm.
my husband was at a reception and he asked him, so what would you say is the biggest problem from your perspective that is facing the American church? And he had a one-word answer, and it was literalism,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that this kind of oversimplification of what it is to read and what it is to read the Bible and what it is to read a translation. And the very fact that there are so many translations into English can either be seen as a distressing threat to the foundation of your faith, or you can think, this is what it is to be a living word. The Spirit is at work as it gets translated and as we enter into it and have the conversations about it, and we don't have to get all nervous and protect our
Mhm.
particular version.
And only until I started learning Czech and trying to do some small translation from Czech to English did I really realize you can't translate one language to another word by word. You have to translate the idea. And so how you choose to translate that idea is an interpretation. But yeah, it's a mistaken idea that you're going to take the Greek and it's going to go word to word to word, because it doesn't work that way.
No,
But that's also because I think in the United States, we don't have a very good understanding of the English language and how it's created and how it's changed over time, which is a lot of what you're getting at. So, yeah.
yeah. And so another thing you said that I wanted to underscore is that we're always translating.
Mm-hmm.
We translate for each other. We translate for children. How are you going to, I still remember when one of my daughters many years ago was about 4 and wandered into the kitchen and said, "Mommy, what's a virgin?" Just think about how you would answer that for a 4-year-old. It takes some creative workarounds to find out why exactly are you answering? How do I unpack this in an age-appropriate way?
Mm-hmm.
And we translate for each other in terms of how we understand the question. So to think that anything about the exchange of words is simple, is delusional.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the beauty and joy of it is that it's so complex, and just, you can hang out for a half an hour and talk about a particular word. One way to enrich the conversation about anything is to go to etymologies.
Mm-hmm.
And we just look them up. But, what did this word used to mean? And then put that into the essay, because that just keeps reminding us of the depth dimension.
And I think it goes back to what you said earlier. Also, it depends on who's saying it, who has the right or privilege to say certain things. And I don't think we take that, like, I know when I use the word blind, I make a lot of sighted people really uncomfortable until I explain what I mean by that. That it's that I have low vision and I use a variety of alternative techniques to do things that you do with your eyes, I do in other ways.
Right.
And so it's just easier to say I'm blind, but that freak-sighted people out until I explain, well, this is what I mean by
Right.
this term.
Right.
But I can say that because I'm blind, but I kind of resent it sometimes when a lot of other people try to offer interpretation on that are fully sighted and don't necessarily understand the experience that goes behind that privilege that I have to talk about it in that way that I don't think a sighted person does. So it also depends on who says it and how.
Right. That's for sure. And and some of this has to do with tonality too, how you claim your space in a conversation. And I think we can get, especially if we're people of privilege and we're healthy and we are white and we have all kinds of layers of privilege, then it's easy to get all apologetic. But I think to find ways of saying, here's how I'm situated. And here's where I think I probably have a limited perspective. And from where I sit, I'm going to share with you what I see. But you have to do the meta conversation in order to build the bridge, open up the space. It's a dance. And if we're going to open our mouths or put words on the page at all, it seems to me we have to consent to entering that highly charged magnetic field. All words have fields of meaning. And there's resonance. There's a lot going on at the level of melody and tone. That's why even doctors who I've worked with for years, many of them realize the value of taking at least a short course in poetry. If you pay the kind of attention to language that you do in a poetry course, you listen to patients differently. You listen to the metaphors they reach for when they're talking about their own suffering. You listen to where they take a breath or a pause. You listen to where they hesitate. You just hear words differently if you have a practice of poetry, because poetry slows you down and says, look at the words and what they do to each other while they're sitting there on the line, not yet being a sentence because they're doing something before they grow up to be a sentence. Hey, Brian, do you want to ask? You had some interview questions if you want to ask them.
No. I'd rather just let this go. Vicki,
Okay.
You had your hand raised.
I was just going to say, Heather Cox Richardson does an excellent job of translating history for me. As you were saying earlier, she interprets and translates a lot of terms with their historical meaning as compared to what they mean now. And you said that really well, but she does that for me too.
She does that, right? And she puts dates on it too. And I think that's helpful. She says, well, in 1869, as Reconstruction was just beginning, here's what someone said, here's what they were getting at. So you actually situate it at a time and place. And that's a little reminder that at that moment in time, the language, like the fashions and the food, had its own character.
Yeah. Context. Yeah.
Goes with the text.
No, Marilyn, I think, you had, I think, some more suggestions, right, in terms of how to deal with different aspects of this. I'd love to hear those.
Okay, so just to review, the main one is the meta conversation, which is to have the conversation about the conversation, always to find occasions to lift up a word and say, just in the course of things, not in some pedantic way, but just to say, that's a really interesting word. And here's why. Or I had a conversation with a woman. I do a lot of coaching with writers who are working on books. And so I'm working with this wonderful woman in Oakland. She's African-American. She's 75. She went back to seminary when she was 70. She's got a memoir. I can't wait for it to be published. But we've talked about the term African-American and Black, and do you capitalize white if you capitalize Black, and all of that. So interesting conversation. And we've also brought up that question of who gets to say what. But for her, one of the issues is that it's a generational issue. She's 75. She wants this book to be read by a younger generation of people her son's age who haven't had access to the kind of beloved community, as she puts it, that she had in an all-Black neighborhood in Nebraska when she was growing up. And sort of, so part of it is to try to take the measure of some of the losses that urban kids have suffered as the family structures and the socioeconomic circumstances in which they grow up have changed, and the notion of family has changed. And by the way, family is one of those loaded words. If you think about focus on the family and the notion of protecting the family that you often hear used in the context of the nuclear family, all you have to do is look at a social history and recognize that the nuclear family is a historical anomaly. For most of history, it's been extended families and villages and people, various combinations of relatives and aunties and in-laws and people in the weave of child raising and caring for one another that's very different from the North American nuclear family. So she talks about that, what family means and what family has come to mean to people who have to do recombinant families because of all the social pressures. A colleague of mine who one time did a little talk for students called Focus Off the Family, which was really just talking about broadening the family circle, widening your definition of who's given to you to love. Who are the people among whom you conduct your life on intimate terms? So it's really interesting and kind of fun to shake up normal terms. And that's another part of the strategy, is not always to take on the obvious trigger words, but to pause over what seem to be just completely ordinary, innocuous words like family.
Hey,
Looked like there
Marilyn.
was a question.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I was trying to think of that earlier, what the word that had to do with gender that people use as a code, and it was family. But sometimes they use that to like establish like an anti like gay stance or whatever. They call things, they label it family and family friendly, and it's like a code they call it. I've even seen a bathroom at World Vision called the family bathroom. And anyway, it's just like, as opposed to like gender or whatever, but it's an example. So.
Yeah, right. No, I think that the term code is really important here, that some words are not only loaded in the sense that they're sensitive or that the meanings vary, but that very particular meanings are attached to them by very particular groups. And if you use it in that way, it's part of the code and it identifies you. It's like a badge. It looked like Kate, are you?
Yeah, Kate, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah. Hi, Marilyn. I'm Kate Rademacher. Thanks for this. This is awesome. So interesting and helpful. I wanted to just ask a question about like how much time this takes to do what you're suggesting about the meta conversation. I mean, I love it, but like even what you just said, it's like language can be a shortcut. And I think in some ways we have to challenge ourselves. Like if I say I'm a progressive Christian, and that, is like what I'm trying to do is say, you're in my tribe, you're out of my tribe, we're allies. We can, in 3 words know that we're, and that's in some ways exactly what Jesus would not want us to do, right? He would not want us to say, you're in, you're out. He would want us to love each other, I think. So I hear you, and I feel like having the meta conversation takes a lot more of time. I'll give you another example. I joined about 10 minutes late, so I actually work in global health and development. So your point about developing countries is well taken. We're having a robust conversation about decolonization right now and localization. And, so like some people really resonate with the word decolonization, some people don't. Some people who live in the global South don't like that word at all. They don't want to hear the word colonial. So we have to have the conversation, and we can't even agree on the term, which is fine. Like that's part of the process, but it takes time. And then when you say to your donor, oh, we're working on localization or working on decolonization, like you need to have a shortcut. I guess that's my question. Like, is there a place to align on shortcuts because of the interest of time? Or do we just have to move slower? Thank you.
Slow is not bad. I said to somebody at some point, I think we need a slow language movement, the way we have a slow food movement. But, and that's another.
That should be a book. That's a great idea.
But I think we need also, that's the practice of poetry helps us to slow down. Just taking a little time to say the sentence. I am not a good model of this because I tend to go in and think, okay, we only have an hour, and then speed up. So slowing down is part of it, but I also think that's a wonderful question because in fact, obviously there are occasions to use those coded terms to let people know we don't have to unpack it. We don't have to worry about this. I think we're on the same page here. The message, I think we're in the same tribe, is not a bad message. It puts you at a different starting point to say, I think we're like-minded people. And there are some conversations we don't have to have very much because I'm there. I'm with you. So as an expression of solidarity or support or alliance, just, it's like the handshake. But of course, we don't want to get too clubby about it. And to the matter of how much time, actually a whole meta conversation to say, you know, we're just going to stop for a page here or a chapter and talk about some words. And maybe you can do that in the middle of an essay, or you can do it even in the middle of novels. Certainly Wendell Berry is a good example of this. In some of his stories and fiction, he'll have whole paragraphs of description where he will pause over words. I'm thinking of a little short story about war that's in the book Fidelity. The short story is called Coming Home, I think. But he tells about the experience of a soldier, and he makes the words themselves, the words that the soldier bypasses. They went and they destroyed things, and they killed people, and they trampled the crops, you know, to say what it is the soldiers did. So I think you can take a lot of time in fruitful digression over the words themselves, and that can normalize that as part of the conversation. On the other hand, you can do it in a sentence. You can sometimes do it in a clause. So I'm using the term progressive, by which I mean, and then you know, plug in a couple of terms to fill in the blank, just to say, I do have a particular meaning for this. You want to talk more about it? Fine, but to situate yourself briefly. And that's an art. It's just part of the art to pause over the word for a clause, for a sentence, for a paragraph, but it doesn't have to take very long. And sometimes it's just, and by that, here's what I don't mean, you know. But
right. And I think it's a good, sorry, I just want to say it, and I know Alicia has her hand raised. You know, I think it takes such discipline, I mean, to do that. Like if you were to say, I'm a progressive Christian, and by that I mean, and if you could say it in a sentence or two or a clause, the amount of work it would take to be able to do that would be really good work, you know, as opposed to just being lazy, which is what I think we do, which is like, I'm a progressive Christian. And then like, you think, wink, wink, we know what that means. Right. Whereas like really to say, what do I mean by that? And then to say it succinctly, that's like, you know, a lot of work, but it's worthwhile work. Maybe that's, you know.
And you could leave people with questions. I mean, you could say something like, I'm a progressive Christian. And by that term, I mean that I'm speaking about how I read the Bible and how I understand the whole project of reading. Then I can move on. And if they want to ask me about that, they can. But to say that term has a whole field of discussion that's possible, it itself is valuable, I think. So part of our work is to develop that art, and part of it is to normalize the conversation so that we're always calling each other's attention to the language. And by the way, one little shift it's really helpful to make is from I have to have the conversation to I get to. if I get to publish, if I get to speak, I get to do this. I get to talk about the language. I get to help sharpen the tools or the instruments that all of us use. Hooray. Alicia, I look like you were.
Yeah, Alicia's patiently had her hand raised. Go ahead, Alicia.
No problem at all. I'm still taking notes based off the, the discussion before me. I was just going to say, I really relate to this conversation because my personality type is, I hate to hurt feelings. So I think I naturally try to think about my words and how is this going to be received. I was going to say, in navigating that, one of the topics that comes up for me is it's also like a soul searching, like, why am I laboring over my language? And is this coming from a place of fear, or is it coming purely from sensitivity? Because I think sometimes when we get in this habit, the two can blend. Like sometimes I'm trying to make sure I don't offend when I don't mean to offend. And other times I'm wondering, am I concealing my convictions because I think revealing them would offend, but I actually don't apologize for that conviction, and just sorting that out. So I don't know if it's a question, but it's just something I wrestle with.
Such a wonderful point. I think we all do, right? And I think timidity shouldn't be confused with kindness. And there are certainly times to just put it out there and let the chips fall. There are times to confront. And so all of us, all of this is a practice of discernment. But I think that love of language is at the heart of this kind of work. And when I wrote Caring for Words, after the long introduction, the very first chapter was love words. If you do it because you really feel called to clarity and you want to celebrate the delight of the gift of language, and you love playing around with words and you want to invite people into that play space, then I think you won't feel as timid about who am I going to offend. And that's the other thing in terms of strategies. I think we can find ways to be good humored about a lot of this, even though it's so fraught and it's so sometimes painful. We can afford to laugh. I've told this story so many times, I'm sure a couple of you have heard it, but I had a wonderful mentor who grew up in the Deep South. She was a very articulate woman. And she took me under her wing when I was a young professor in my early 30s. And she would just call me every once in a while and she'd say, well, honey, how are you? And so, I'd go on about my complaints and laments. And then at some point in almost every conversation, she'd say, you can afford to let that go. Or you can afford to give that some time. You can afford to let him have his say. The word she gave me as one of her best legacies is the word afford. Like, we can afford to laugh because we have access to such grace and such deep resources of spiritual renewal. We can afford to make some mistakes. We can afford not to be timid, and we can afford to have a certain lightness of being with all of this. It doesn't all have to be argument. So one word to really hang on to is play. We get to play with words. And if we can find ways to be hospitable and invitational about inviting others into that play space by the way we pause over them and say, hey, look at this. Look at this word. Do you know what? There's a really interesting story behind this word. Let's do that before we go on. No, that can be so inviting. So yeah, lighten up is part of the strategy. And just taking pleasure in it and sharing the pleasure.
Mimi, you have a question?
This is more of a statement and experience, but it goes into what part of what Marilyn was saying. I'm kind of being very gentle in how I'm presenting this. So sometimes I pause, but I know in my gifts, sometimes I'm a change agent and I put out things, and even in company that should understand, they get really riled.
Mm-hmm.
So what I learned out of something that happened in January, and it was dangerous conversation, though I didn't realize it would be,
Mm-hmm.
is there was kind of an experience of somebody was very reactive. And I learned to let go. But there's a risk taking when you feel called to put something out there that is morally and ethically of the moment. So you become a change agent, but you don't know how the fallout's going to be.
Right.
And I'll just leave it at that, because they're still not willing to engage the hard questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so you talked about the meta conversation. The group tried to do that, but they really weren't risk taking because they didn't want to go to the deeper level, because I think it was too frightening. So sometimes all you can do is be the messenger, and sometimes you have to just realize that's your role in that situation and let go. Any comments to that?
Well, sometimes you're right. You have to. I remember the first time somebody told me, and it really registered when I was young, you're never going to do anything effective in the world if you're not willing to disappoint some people or make some people angry. It's all a matter of discernment, right? But as soon as we start taking pleasure in pissing people off, then I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we invested in here? But I get your point that there's courage involved in having the conversation. However, if we have any power in that space, one thing is to make it playful. One is to say there are alternatives to argument. Let us be in exploratory mode. And that's a bit of my conversation too, to say, so here's what I want to do. I really don't want to go to the place of argument. I'd like to hear, and the Quakers, by the way, are really good about this.
Yes.
We gather for meetings.
Right.
Each person present gets to say what they have to say at the table with no response at first.
Right.
So that you don't feel as though you're already in an embattled space when you speak.
Right. Yeah. But I would like to say, am I muted?
No.
No. Sometimes that just isn't going to happen. Sometimes people become really reactive and they can't take that silence that you're talking about. They have to just dig in their heels. You know, in other words, there's no place to even play, which is kind of tragic, but
it is.
Go on.
But I think that also is a matter of discernment. There are moments to say, this isn't a conversation we're ready to have. And
right.
You know, you don't always have to be in the conversation. So I think that creating the word hospitality seems really important, that we can offer the hospitality. But if I had someone in my home who was really being obnoxious and destructive, I can imagine getting up and saying, it's time for you to leave now. You know, I don't want you here on this behavior is really not okay in my home.
Right. I agree with all that. And in this particular situation, I'm not going into details, but I realized I had to leave the situation as it was and go on. There really actually wasn't room for me to stay in the conversation.
Right. Remember when Jesus tells the disciples, when you go to a town, if they won't hear you, shake the dust off your boots and leave? That is a useful little piece of scripture.
Really?
Yeah. I find the fallout from what happened actually interesting. People come back to me from the group who want to either have more spiritual mentoring, or they're willing to engage the conversation. And some people can't even go there So I've kind of just allowed it to be. And it's also where you have to discern what your path is, what you're called to do. And, you just can't, sometimes you just can't go backward. You have to go onward, like you're saying.
And to say with humility, I believe I'm right about this. I could be wrong, but from where I stand, this is what I see. Always to leave room for the fact that we're not coming from a place of absolute rightness, but we're trying to be faithful to what we've seen,
Yes.
known, and
Yes.
I think a question for ourselves to hold on to, besides what do you mean or what do I mean, is what do I want to be faithful to here when I'm translating, when I'm writing my story? What do I want to be faithful to as I write this poem? It's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be faithful to the commitment to do this in an hour, but also, Vicki, you have your hand up, so.
I agree. Is it Mimi? I agree with what Mimi was saying. You don't always know who you're reading with your truth when you're speaking your truth. And I've had many occasions where I'll be having a fiery conversation online, usually on Facebook in some thread, and somebody will private message me, and either private message me like a total stranger to, curse me and say, "Oh, you horrible human being, how did you say that?" But sometimes I'll have someone private message me who didn't want all that fallout from the dangerous conversation and just comes in quietly and privately and says, "I really agree with what you're saying. Keep up the good work." It's like, yeah. And they come in afterwards, don't they, Mimi? And they sneak in because they don't want all that conflict and the scary stuff that you're dealing with. They'll come in and say, "Keep going."
So helpful.
Yeah. I've had that experience. Thank you, Vicki.
Yeah.
So we are past our time here, but it's obviously been a very juicy, useful conversation. I hope I can use a term like that without it being misinterpreted or anything.
Juicy.
Before we do finish, I really like to give Marilyn a chance to tell us about her upcoming work. I know there's at least one book that's going to be released.
Yeah. Well, I just finished co-writing a book about, it's called, I don't like the title very much, but it wasn't my choice. It's called The Mindful Grandparent, but it was Shirley Showalter and I co-authored it, and it's about learning moments in grandparenting. So that was fun. And then I just got today the first copies of a book that's it's a collection by a number of colleagues. It's called New Thoughts on Old Books. Why read Homer, Milton, or a medieval nun at a time like this? And there's a very clear statement in the introduction that it's not a defense of the traditional canon, but there is this question of, now that we are realizing how important it is to read works from other traditions and cultures and so on, where do we put the works that from the so-called classics, and why would we go back to them? So it's a number of essays by people I respect, addressing why read Milton, why read Spencer, why read, anybody who has a claim to irrelevancy. So that's kind of fun.
And just FYI, Marilyn and Shirley and I recently did an interview about the Mindful Grandparent book. So if you go to the Writing for Your Life website under, book launch interviews, you can hear more about that book. And Marilyn and I just a few moments ago said, okay, we need to schedule a time to do an interview about the new book that you just described. So you can look forward to that coming up at some time here in the future. So thank you again, everyone. And thank you so much, Marilyn, for leading us through this.
Oh, yeah. Well, happy writing.
Our next set of monthly meetings like this will start in September. So we won't have any for the next couple of months, but I've got them all planned for September, October, November, December, and January on a variety of different topics with a variety of different folks. So you can look forward to that, and God bless.
Well, bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.
Bye.